Yeah. بسم الله. ألا يلا ألا يلا بنظرة من العين الرحيمة تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة. ألا يلا بنظرة من العين الرحيمة تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض. ألا يا صاح لا تجزع وتضجر وسلم للمقادير كي تحمد وتؤجر. ألا يا الله بنظرة من العين الرحيمة تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة. وكن راض بما قدر المولى ودبر ولا تسخط قضى الله رب العرش الأكبر. ألا يا الله بنظرة من العين تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة. وكن صابر وشاكر ألا يا الله بنظرة تكن فايز وظافر. ألا يا الله ومن أهل السرائر. ألا يا الله رجال الله من كل ذي قلب منور مصفى من جميع الدنس طيب مطهر. ألا يا الله بنظرة من العين الرحيمة كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة. وذي دنيا دنيا حوادثها كثيرة وعيشتها حقيرة ومدتها قصيرة. لا يا الله بنظرة تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة. ولا يحرص عليها سوى أعمى البصيرة عديم العقل لو كان يعقل كان أفكار. لا يا الله بنظرة من العين تداوي كل ما بي سقيمة يفكر في فناها. ألا يا الله وفي كثرة عناها. ألا يا الله وفي قلة غناها. فطوبى ثم طوبى لمن منها تحذر وطلقها وفي طاعة الرحمن شمار. لا يا الله بنظرة رحيمة تداوي كل ما بي سقيما. لا يا عين جودي بدمع منك سائل على ذاك الحبيب الذي قد كان نازل. لا يا الله بنظرة تداوي كل ما بي سقيما. معانا في المرابع وأصبح سفر راحل وأمسى القلب والبال من بعده مكدر. لا يا الله بنظرة تداوي كل ما بي ولكن حسبي الله. لا يا الله بنظر وكل الأمر لله. لا يا الله بنظرة ولا يبقى سوى الله. لا يا الله على بشار جادت سحائب رحمة البر وحياهم بروح الرضا ربي وبشار. لا يا الله بنظرة تداوي إيما وحياهم بروح الرضا ربي وبشر بها ساداتنا والشيوخ العارفون وأهلنا وأحباب قلبي نازلون لا يالله بنظرة تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة ومنهم في سرائر فؤادي قاطنون بساحه تربى من ذكي المسك أعطار لا يالله بنظرة تداوي كل ما بي سقيما منازل خير سادا لا يالله لكل الناس قادا لا يالله محبتهم سعادة لا يالله ألا يا بخت من زارهم بالصدق واندار إليهم معتني كل مطلوبه تيسر لا يالله تداوي كل ما بي من أمراض سقيمة اللهم صل وسلم سلام سلام كمسك الختام عليكم حبابنا يا كرام ومن ذكرهم أنسنا في الظلام ونور لنا بين هذا الأنام سكنتم فؤادي ورب العباد وأنتم مرامي وأقصى المراد فهل تسعدوني بصفو الوداد وهل تمنحوني شريف المقام أنا عبدكم يا أهيل الوفا وفي قربكم مرهمي والشفاء فلا تسقموني بطول الجفا ومنوا بوصل ولو في المنام أموت وأحيا على حبكم وذلي لديكم وعزي بكم وراحت روحي رجاء قربكم وعزمي وقصدي إليكم دوام فلا عشت إن كان قلبي سكن إلى البعد عن أهله والوطن ومن حبهم في الحشا قد قطن وخامر مني جميع العظام إذا مر بالقلب ذكر الحبيب ووادي العقيق وذاك الكثيب يميل كمايل القضيب الرطيب ويهتز من شوقه والغرام أموت وما زرت ذاك الفنا وتلك الخيام وفيها المنى ولم أدن يوما مع من دنا للأثم المحيا وشرب المدام. لئن كان هذا فيا غربتي ويا طول حزني ويا كربتي، ولي حسن ظن به قربتي بربي وحسبي به يا غلام. عسى الله يشفي وليل الصدود بوصل الحبايب وفك القيود، فربي رحيم كريم ودود يجود على من يشاء بالمرام. إلهي نجنا من كل ضيق بجاه المصطفى مولى الجميع، وهب لنا في مدينته قرارا ورزقا ثم دفنا في البقيع. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us in these sessions, Ya Arhamar Rahimin, and to give us understanding of this religion. Welcome to all of you that are joining us today. And I want to say at the outset of this session, I hope that those that had just come today got a chance to listen to the lectures last night. Will set the tone for everything that follows. And this session, which is going to be on the fiqh of marriage, primarily from the Shafi'i school of thought, that it's really important because oftentimes marriage is relegated to rights, which is extremely, extremely limiting, and that's not the way that things tend to work. Yes, that these ahkam are there to guide us, and in them that is light, and that there's guidelines whereby which if we adhere to them, that our lives will be regulated. But when we talk about marriage, that we are talking about something that is right at the essence of what it means to practice our deen. And that requires that we have a holistic perspective and a holistic approach to it. And this is why we started talking yesterday about some of the metaphysical considerations of that understanding that male and female as pairs, one of the great manifestations of pairs in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's that creation, and then also that approaching that marriage from the standpoint of the spiritual path, and how that ultimately this whole matter is about drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is about drawing near to Him. And that these are very important before we get into the rights conversation. And that we'll be briefly covering that in this session and pointing to a few things, but also mentioning some things of general benefit, certain ahkam of the sacred law of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and ultimately everything that it is that we do. We simultaneously are responding to that thing, ideally, if we are a complete believer, from the lens of Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. Everything that happens, we have to simultaneously look at things from the lens of Ihsan, from the lens of Iman, and from the lens of that Ihsan. So what's an example of that? let's say, for instance, we're at work and something happens at work. And the lens of Iman is the lens of seeing everything as being from Allah. So we disconnect there for a minute and remind ourselves that outwardly, okay, I was mistreated by individual A at work. Ultimately, this is from the degree of Allah. And we know, لَن يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا, is that nothing will afflict us except what Allah has written for us. It is impossible for anyone or anything to harm you if Allah Ta'ala has not written that for you. No disease, no difficulty, no hardship, nothing can that afflict you if Allah Ta'ala doesn't decree it. So we have to respond first and foremost from the lens of Iman, seeing that being from Allah Ta'ala. And then there will be a hukum shar'i. There's a legal lens that we have to look at everything. So that there's certain things that are permissible for us to do, and there's certain things that are impermissible for us to do, then there's things that might be recommended for us to do. So that in that particular situation, if we're being mistreated, it's permissible for us to defend yourself. That's within the realm from the standpoint of the sacred law, permissible. You can defend yourself. You can explain. Or that if it's physical confrontation, of course you can physically defend yourself. But there are certain things that you can't do. So someone criticizes you, then all of a sudden you start making up things about them. You start lashing out at them. You start that physically harming them. They say something to you, so pow, you hit them. Right? You've done something now that you're not supposed to do. So there's a legal dimension to every situation that we're in. So there's a theological dimension, a dimension of Iman. And that's the dimension of seeing it as being from Allah. Then there's a legal dimension that tells us what is the ruling of the sacred law in this particular scenario in terms of what is permissible, or that the other categories of the sacred law. And then there's a dimension of ihsan. And that is the dimension of excellence, of good character, of that doing the very best thing we can possibly do. The best of all possible goods is the highest degree of ihsan. And there's degrees. So everything that it is that we do in life, we simultaneously have to look at it in a three-dimensional way from Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And that's when we become whole as believers. If we're only looking at it from one particular lens, then we're going to fall short. And especially if that lens is a merely legal lens. Is that human beings are not robots. And if we reach the point where that we are that pulling people in one direction or another based upon rights, or you owe me this or you owe me that, yes, justice is essential that we stand for, and that we absolutely, there needs to be justice. But if you want to talk about a healthy relationship, a healthy family, a healthy society, the glue of that, yes, it has to be on the bedrock of justice, but the glue of that is ultimately ihsan. The glue of a healthy relationship is ihsan between two spouses, just as it's the case between two different community members, between brothers with their fellow brothers, sisters with their fellow sisters. All of our relationships, ultimately, the true glue for those relationships is ihsan. Is that if people are just doing what is permissible and demanding their rights, you might be able to tolerate them and still have to kind of work on your heart not to hold grudges or have a bad opinion of them. But if we want there to be love, if we want there to, that we move towards the ideal, again, at the individual, at the level of the family, and at the civilizational level, and that this is that very clear that this is what our deen wants. And that ultimately this is what you would call takamul, where there is mutual perfection, and that people are all coming together to do what it is that they can do to contribute, and things then become whole incomplete at that point. And we oftentimes are extremely far from that ideal, but it's important that we recognize that there is an ideal, as we mentioned yesterday. Otherwise, it just turns into that non-stop bantering and tit for tat and people demanding their rights and so forth. So I think that's important for us going into this to recognize. And I also want to reiterate what we mentioned that yesterday, is that this is a huge topic, and we end up saying this pretty much for every retreat, because once you get into these topics that you really need to know, you feel like that. SubhanAllah, the last retreat was on the etiquettes of eating. And you think that, okay, this was one of the books that we're actually able to cover most of what Imam al-Ghazali wrote on that topic. And that his words and thoughts were just as that relevant to his time as they were to our time. And then there's some things that needed to be added in terms of how we think about food in our particular time. But you start to go into the depths of food and how important it is, and how that it's a part of the spiritual path, and all of the different ways, things that we need to know in our time to understand how to eat properly and how to properly partake in this human act. And you feel the same way when it comes to marriage, is that there are so many different topics that one could approach, that the goal here is to cover this at a basic level with some of the things that are most important, considering that everybody who is attending and is either married or looking in to get married, hopefully, wants to understand the religious dimension of it, and wants to tie it to the spiritual path. And if we don't have that, we really need to work on that. And that surely there are many people that we know that that's just what other people do, so we end up just getting married. But we want to go beyond that, where that we start to find deeper meaning in it. And this is what Imam Ghazali does throughout the Yahya. He wants us to find deeper meaning in the religious life. It's okay, eating's eating. No. Let's have a much deeper approach to eating. That he's going to talk about brotherly relationships eventually. He's going to talk about that a number of other different topics that are in this quarter of the Yahya, but he wants us to go deeper in our understanding of them, these things that we customarily do, just as he did the same thing in relation to the ibadat. So this is the attempt, insha'Allah ta'ala. So now moving on to some of the basic ahkam. Do our best to get through what we can here. And the first topic, actually at the outset, I think I'm going to do this. There's a couple books that I actually really do recommend for anyone who is considering marriage or anyone who actually is already married. It's always good to review this topic. The first is titled Initiating and Upholding an Islamic Marriage by Hidayah Hartford. And it's a very good read. We're going to be looking at sections of that in this session, inshallah ta'ala. The next is Healthy Muslim Marriage by Sheikh Abdurrahman ibn Yusuf, Mufti Abdurrahman ibn Yusuf Mangara. And this is a little bit longer. The print is a little bit smaller, and it's about 250 pages. So you can just see, and even this is that obviously there's topics that he is not covering. So this is a topic that we have to go into a lot of depth regarding. And even just looking at some of the questions that are here, again, we're trying to cover the basics. Undoubtedly, there are pressing questions that everybody has on this topic. And that oftentimes there's a lot of pain associated with this topic. And that was the last disclaimer that we'll say in this session, which was really meant for everybody here at the outset, is that in addressing some of the basics of this topic that we want to be sensitive to that those who are somehow in a position where they are have been pained by a relationship that they've entered into, or been pained by not being able to enter into a relationship. So the first topic is who should marry. And the general ruling of the sacred law for both men and women is that it is recommended to get married. And that there are certain conditions, and again, this is primarily according to the Shafi school, is that when that a man is able to do so and he's desirous of doing so, it's recommended for him to get married. And this is the general ruling. And actually, a good portion of the Yahya, Hujjat al-Islam, actually spins on this topic, should one get married or not? And we're not going into all those details because we're assuming that the vast majority of people are inclining towards marriage. There surely might be people who just say, hey, I'm not going to get married. And this is important for us to note. And that because the text proofs for marriage, like the Prophet ﷺ saying, an-nikah min sunnati, that getting married is from my sunnah. فَمَنْ رَغِبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي. And so whoever turns away from my sunnah is not from me. That stands as the basis for this legal ruling. But there are surely situations where it's actually advisable for people not to get married, and that is the realm of the scholar to determine what are the exact times and conditions where people should get married or they should refrain from marriage. But this is the general rule, that if someone that is desirous of doing so and they have the ability to do so, i.e. specifically here financially defined, is that it's recommended for them to do so. And the same thing applies for a woman, is that if that she desires to get married, that it is recommended for her to do so. And then we have this other topic of that engagement. And so now in looking at the opposite gender, now we're speaking about this solely here in the topic, solely here in the conversation of looking into marriage as opposed to outside of that. And it's interesting that the fuqaha, at least in the Shafi school, will mention the other ahkam of the gaze, who it's permissible to that gaze upon and who it's permissible to not gaze upon. And that they also will discuss the various topics of awra and so forth and so on in this particular that section. And so that the sunnah of our Prophet is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that when someone wants to marry, is that it is permissible for them to look at the opposite gender. And that whatever they need to do in order to determine whether or not that a suitable match for them, they're able to do. Now, when we talk about looking at the opposite gender, we're talking about looking at the face and the hands. And that one of the things that needs to be pointed out here is that is a common misunderstanding, is that when people are in the process of getting married, is that you can talk to your future spouse for months and months on end, and that it's permissible to talk, to get to know them, and to look at each other to the point where you determine whether, okay, that's acceptable and I'm ready to get married. At that point is that someone has to refrain until the actual bond of marriage. This is very, very commonly misunderstood. The permissibility of looking and engaging is to determine whether or not that the marriage could happen and whether or not that it would work out. And so it's permissible to talk and to that gaze at the other until someone decides that. And that there are situations, and this is oftentimes the way that it was done in a traditional setting, is that you would have family members who would help in the process. And this was a very beautiful way of doing it. Now, having said that, we don't always have that luxury in our time. Sometimes is that people don't have Muslim family members to help them. Or sometimes is that even with Muslim family members that were unable to do so. But that is also a way of doing this, is that having other family members that see the one who's being considered for marriage, and then to describe it to the one, describe her or him to the one who is potentially getting married. And so that this is within the realm of permissibility, and our Prophet ﷺ encouraged this, and as this was that more likely to engender that a lasting relationship. So this is one of the times that it is permissible, whereas that normally is that men and women alike, bin-nas al-Quran, explicitly mentioned in the Quran, are commanded to lower their gaze. And that, alhamdulillah, this is what a beautiful deen that we have, that encourages us to be as far as possible away from zina, wa'udhu billah, which tears a society at its core. Tears a society at its core. And you don't have to go into a long list of proofs to prove that. Is that zina tears society at its core. And that our Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us, do not even come close to zina. Don't even come close to zina. Yani, guard your eyes. Because when someone looks, then they start to think. And then they start to think. And then it starts to rile up their desire. And then once the desire is riled up, then it leads to that more looking. And then it leads to that the physical touch. And then it leads to doing something, nas'allahu as-salam al-afiyah, that is very serious. We need to lower our gaze, both men and women alike. And that even if people think that we're funny, even if people think that we're strange, and I can't tell you how many young men that bring this up, where that if you lower your gaze in high school, people think you're odd, think you're strange, they think that you're maybe not a normal man, and that likewise is that maybe it might be a little bit more accepted that from a woman, but even that in a woman's context is that people think that you're overly shy or that you have some type of personality disorder or something. And this is all a part of being strange in our time. And our Prophet said, فَطُوبَى لِلْغُرَبَى, but it's good to be strange in this time. If you look at that, what most other people are doing, this is not the way that it is that we want to be. So at a certain point, we have to just get comfortable in being what other people think and doing what other people think as strange. So that then we have some of the rules that relate to proposing for marriage or accepting a proposal. So that looking at the opposite gender is permissible. And then if someone wants to propose to someone else, is that this is a good thing to do. And that once someone proposes to someone else and that proposal is accepted, at this point, it is not permissible for someone else to propose to that person. Okay, so this is very common when people are looking into marriage, that different people are looking into different people. And there's no aib in that. And that I know sometimes people that looked at many different families before they said, okay, this is the right match. There's no fault or there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a very healthy thing to try to find a good match. And when it comes to these things, we should be very honest. And I know sometimes people get very, weirded out about these things. Oh, I can't say no to this person. I can't say no to that person. But we should be very honest, is that you don't want to set up a relationship for failure from the beginning. And there's no aib whatsoever. And looking into things and, okay, this is not going to work out. And so that if someone that does put forth a proposal to a particular family, and that the amount of time that elapses that gives the impression that they're not going to accept that proposal, then it's permissible for someone else to propose. Okay? But let's just say that you know that someone was interested in a particular that family, and they put forth a proposal and it was accepted. At that point, it's not permissible for someone else to come along and to propose. They have to wait until either that proposal after being accepted was that rejected or that something else happens. So that's just something very brief about that proposing and accepting a proposal. And then we can get into some of the basic ahkam of the marriage agreement. Essentially, marriage is a spoken contract, and secondarily, it is written down. And so that it's not the other way around, is that it's essentially a spoken contract. And there are integrals, there are obligations of that spoken contract. And usually the easy thing here is people tend to get people to do this for them. That makes it a lot easier so that you don't have to, in the moment it's sometimes hard to remember the detailed rulings of the sacred law. It's good to get someone who's experienced, who knows exactly what is needed, who can help conduct the marriage. But it's also good to know them in general. And the first is the spoken form. So this is the actual verbal contract. And essentially what it is, it's a spoken offer by the guardian and its acceptance by the groom. Okay? So that here we have the guardian that representing the groom. I'm going to have to just go run and get something from upstairs real quick. Actually, can you all just bear with me real quick? 1 second. Forgive me about that. This is the difference between people in our time and people in the previous times. Their knowledge used to be in their hearts, and now we rely upon books. Alhamdulillah. Forgive me for that. Okay, so where were we? So now no one has an excuse about being tired either. Khalas. So where were we? The spoken form. Okay. So the first integral of a valid marriage is the spoken contract. And essentially what it is an offer by the guardian and an acceptance by the groom. So it's a verbal contract. And the way that it tends to work is that whoever's performing the nikah will have the guardian on one side and will have the groom on the other. and they'll put their hands in each other's hands, and then that he'll say to him something that is along the lines of that I marry you to, that it could be his daughter or it could be that to the one that they're charged, and then the person says that I accept. Okay, so it's a very, very simple thing in terms of the process. Marriage in Islam is exceedingly easy. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's made exceedingly difficult culturally. Now, I know that's a huge door that I probably just should not, and can of worms that I should not have that opened up. But on one hand, many of the cultural norms that come to marriage, that come with marriage, depending upon where someone is from, are not necessarily bad, nor are they necessarily anti-Islamic, right? The problem arises when you enter into a new context and people think that they're synonymous with the religion. And it's understandable that people want to go off of their own cultural norms. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But it's also important to have a little bit of flexibility when people have different cultural norms or when times change. And that someone that would have grown up for people whose parents are from the Muslim lands and the expectations and the culture around marriage is very different than young people that grow up here in public schools and even if they're homeschooled in the type of environments in which we live. So this is really, really important. And I really think the golden mean there moving forward is one of balance, is that parents need to be very understanding of their children, just as children need to be understanding of their parents, and try to find that some compromise in the middle, because there's no doubt there's good if their parents are responsible in what their parents see and what their parents want. But at the same time, they have to balance what they want and what they think is good for their child with what the child that wants as well, in the way that they see things. And I've always found that in these situations, rarely, if both sides are willing to make small compromises, and especially if the younger party has adab, do things not work out. Sometimes it's intractable, and there's no way around it. But usually that you can come to that some type of that middle way. So the first is the spoken form of a contract. Now, it's important here that it not be elusive, that it be direct, okay? And say something along the lines, like in Arabic, you would say, enkahtuka, or zawajtuka, I marry you, right, to her, or I marry you to, and you name who that person is, and then the person says definitively, without delay, I accept, okay? So that's really fairly easy, and that's usually that when the fakir performs marriages, I like to write that out ahead of time, where you have all the names and you that kind of walk through exactly how to say it, because in the moment people are a little bit nervous, and everything that tends to go fine. So but that's an obligation, the spoken form. So it's important that we know that. You can't just say, okay, hey, let's just get married. No, there's a way of doing it. And the second is witnesses, okay? There has to be 2 witnesses, and there are certain conditions for each one of these witnesses. And we're not going to go into all those details, conditions. That's what you do for a student of knowledge or someone training to be a mufti. But there are conditions. But there has to be witnesses. And part of this is this is meant to be something that is public. And our Prophet ﷺ that encourages a'linu nikah, that proclaim that marriage, and wadribu alayhi bid-dufuf, and that celebrate it with the beating of drums. And for those, there are certain ulama that permit drums for marriage when they might not permit it in other instances, and then there's ulama that say that drums are always permissible. But here our Prophet ﷺ explicitly said that beat drums, i.e. celebrate and let people know. This is something that should be known, that this is a good thing, this is a public thing, and that it is a societal thing. And that when it becomes public knowledge, then that when people know them and see them together, that there's not suspicions and so forth and so on. So there has to be at least 2 witnesses. And so this is where you start hearing about these different things that people kind of in our time sometimes do, yani through Zoom and this type of thing. And all of these types of things, personally, my advice to you as your Muslim brother is to be very careful. When it comes to marriage, this is one of the times that we should be scrupulous. This is one of the times we should be scrupulous. This is not a time for us to try to bend over backwards to that find fatwa to, okay, maybe this is personal. Now, if we're already married and we did it in a certain way and it's not standard, yes, then it's fine to go back and take such opinion to cover what it is that you've done. But in general, when it comes to marriage, we should be scrupulous. And we should only do it in the right way and in the very best of ways with the utmost etiquette as well. And I know that there is that burning question that it would be remiss for us not to address. And maybe I'll mention it now, and then we can really talk about it. And you all can talk about it in the next session, which is there will be a split session for brothers and for sisters. And then we can touch upon it again in the interactive sessions in the evening as well. But everybody knows the difficulty of our time and the nature of our society and how long people are postponing marriage. And biologically speaking, we know what ages children that become legally responsible and thus are capable of not only being in a marriage, but also that reproduction, it's biology. And then to expect that people to remain that modest and chaste for 5, 10, 15 years, given these realities that biologically and physiologically speaking, and given the nature of our society, is difficult, exceedingly difficult. And if you don't think it's difficult, you have no idea of the world in which you live. And if you've ever been in a position where you are in charge of a community or that deal with counseling in any way, shape, or form, you will know that how many young people are struggling with this. And you'd be surprised that how many people, unfortunately, that get themselves in big trouble because of bad decisions that they make because of this. And this is not just with people that are not Muslim, unfortunately, it's with our Muslim brothers and sisters. These are not just with the families that are not practicing. No, this is widespread. May Allah Ta'ala protect us and preserve us. And I remember when I was in high school, I wasn't Muslim yet. And that I later found out that certain people that I was going to high school with were Muslim. And I was like, whoa, they were Muslim. And I knew what they were doing. And that weren't doing anything much different than what people that were not Muslim were doing. And that this is a very unfortunate reality. But you and I cannot, and now's not really the place for it to live stream and so forth. Usually this is done in kind of a more controlled workshop type setting. But we can't gloss over this like it's not something important. That this is serious and this needs to be solved. And there's very, very serious issues that relate to marriage in our communities that have to ultimately be addressed head on. And again, you can only do so much in a weekend session, but those issues need to be identified, and then people need to have the courage to that deal with each one of them head on, issue after issue. So there has to be witnesses, okay? And that you can't just meet someone and be like, hey, let's get married. All right. And then you go to the local judge and be like, marriage, okay, we're married. This is an Islamic marriage, right? There's a process. So there has to be that spoken form, like a verbal contract, just as there has to be witnesses. And that in the Shafi school is that there has to be a guardian involved. And so that a woman needs a guardian that to be present or to that marry her on her behalf. And that, again, this is there for good, this is there for protection. Now, in that Hanafi school, that speaking to Sheikh Yusuf about this before, it is permissible for a woman that is legally responsible to marry herself, and so that the contract is done differently. And that's important to note. And that having said that, that there are situations, though, where that if she does marry herself, that it could be offensive, although legally valid, yani makruh, without having a guardian to represent her, even if she is the one who's involved in the spoken contract. So it's important to note that opinion, and this would be that a situation that would carefully to be put in its proper place, that by someone who is assessing the degree of need with any particular two individuals involved. But in the Shafi school, it's a requirement, and there has to be a guardian who represents her. And then this poses the question, okay, what if that someone doesn't have a guardian, that they're a convert to Islam and they don't have a guardian? That if we were living in the Muslim world, then it would be very easy. The Qadi or the Islamic judge would be appointed to that marry her on her own behalf. But in the absence of that, is that she can appoint that a male Muslim who is legally upright to act as her guardian and marry her to the groom. This is the way that she would do it. It could be the local imam in the community. It could be that someone that she trusts, is that person would become her guardian. And then after she appoints that particular individual, he would be the one who marries her to that future spouse. And when we talk about guardians, is that a woman's guardian is that, of course, given that they are Muslim, first and foremost, her father. And that if her father is not present, if he's passed away, then it would move before to her brother to her father's father, so her grandfather. But in the absence of her father or her grandfather, then it would move to her brother. Okay? And then they talk about, okay, what if she has multiple brothers and so forth and so on? And there's detailed rulings that, which we're not going to go into now, but it would move from the father to the grandfather to the brother. And then there's a number of other that are in that list as well, that at later points. And in the end, if none of them exist, then it would move to the Islamic judge up there. If not, she would appoint someone, like we mentioned before, to marry her on her behalf, which, again, these issues from a legal dimension open up huge doors. And that speaking to someone who was a divorce lawyer, given this is that specialty of law, he mentioned to me not too long ago, he says, I don't understand how Muslims get married and they don't have a contract going into the marriage. And what he meant by that is that he has seen so many nasty divorces that end up in court, where he has non-Muslim judges telling him and the people he's representing, why are you bringing your problems to me? I'm going to spend a short period of time looking into the situation with very little context and background and making a decision that is going to affect the rest of your life and the life of your children. Why don't you all work this out yourself? This is a judge saying this. And the conclusion he's come to is that people that are practicing Muslims should stipulate that in the event of conflict or divorce, is that you rule out going to a non-Muslim judge to judge between you. That you move towards arbitration and you stipulate what that arbitration will be like. So you go into it knowing that, God forbid, if that relationship does go sour and you end up moving towards divorce, that it's going to be done in an Islamic way. And as we learn to live here in these countries, hopefully, these things will be more and more developed. Still, they are significantly underdeveloped, unfortunately. And again, it's sad to have to speak about marriage kind of in this way, But you and I all know that sometimes these types of things happen. So there has to be a guardian in the Shafi school that is marrying her on her behalf. So we have the verbal contract, we have the witnesses, and we have the bride's guardian. And then we have the bride and the groom. And obviously, you can't have a marriage if you don't have a bride and a groom. And that's the ahkam in terms of who can marry, that in relation to that differ. As for the bride, it is not lawful or valid for a Muslim woman to be married to anyone besides a Muslim. As for the groom, it is that he can marry a Muslim or that Christian or Jew. Now, in the Shafi school, it's extremely strict in terms of which Christians and which Jews. They stipulate that it has to be from a family that traces their lineage to an undistorted that version of Christianity and Judaism, قبل التبديل والتحريف, which is pretty much impossible in our time, right? In other schools is that they say that it's enough for someone that says that, okay, I'm Christian or I'm Jewish, that suffices, just that they identify with that particular. But in the Shafi school, technically, that doesn't really apply to our time because finding that in someone is virtually impossible. But anyhow, nevertheless, that is the ruling. So those are the 5 main conditions of a valid marriage. But then we move to what is called the mahar, the bride's marriage payment. And this essentially is the money or property that a husband must pay a woman in order to marry her. And this is the sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that this is an obligation that there be a mahar, and different schools stipulate different amounts. In the Shafi school is that what is that important is that it be anything that may be lawfully used as a price. Okay? Anything that can be bought, anything that can be sold. And that could be given immediately, which is better, or it could be deferred, or it could be a combination of the two. And in other schools that they stipulate a minimum amount. So in the Hanafi school, they say, for instance, that it must be not less than 10 dirhams, okay, which is approximately 35 grams of silver. So there's a minimum amount that some schools place. And usually I don't think in our context that's a problem giving the minimum amount. But our Prophet did say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the most blessed that spouses are those that have the lightest dowries. And I think really what we want in this regard is balance. And there are people that go to extremes in one way or the other. And there's nothing that this is ultimately that something that is given. And there's a practical dimension amongst many of the other wisdoms of the bride payment, the marriage payment, which is that in the event that they do separate, is that someone has an amount to that tend to their needs, that especially in that early period, depending upon the type of divorce, is dependent upon whether maintenance or not is required. Again, speaking all this Islamically, that there are whole other rules altogether when that someone gets legally married and someone is separated, for instance, by a judge. But that there's a practical dimension to this. And balance is what we always want. But you do also see, and this is, I think, more of a problem in my experience in the Muslim world than it is here. Here, I think that most of the marriages that I've been involved in, that it's been very balanced in a reasonable amount. That someone is able to cover, and that if they would go their separate ways, that it's substantial enough to take care of her needs. But in the Muslim world, Ya Latif, how much that marriage has been postponed, and the type of things that people are requesting, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and that people that don't have a lot of money to begin with in a way to even earn money so that they can't get married until they're 35 years old or something. You'd be surprised that how many Muslims in many Muslim countries today have to postpone marriage until their late 20s, until their early 30s, simply because they can't afford what is being required of them in terms of the mahr, the marriage payment, and all of the other things that are around it. And this is a problem. And this is a source of fitna. And that is something that is negative. No matter what you try to say, and no matter what you're trying to protect that your daughter from, that win a family that is demanding that, you are creating a much bigger problem for society by doing that. And so what we want when it comes to these things is balance. And again, going against the grain in these things is something is that you and I all have to consciously make a decision to do. And the next topic here is the wedding feast, which is also what is called the walima, and which is also an area where people tend to, that again, that go to extremes. The wedding feast, the walima, is a sunnah. And this is where you have oftentimes in Muslim culture where people will do the nikah, which is a valid nikah, where now they're married, they can be together. And then they don't live together until they do the walima. That's culture. That's not a bad thing. That's fine to do it that way. And this is actually a good way that if people are interested in getting married, rather than make them wait unnecessarily for 2 years or a year or a long period of time, it makes much more sense to get married legally so they're married. Then they can talk to each other. Then they can be with each other and they're not falling into haram. And then you can do the walima at a later time and say, okay, after the walima, this is when we're going to publicly celebrate and then move in together. That is something fine to do. If you've just done an engagement after deciding whether or not you will or want to marry that person, as we mentioned, is that you have to remain from talking to them and seeing them or being alone with them. It's not permissible. So these are things that we want to consider. And again, you want to do things right. And the vast majority of instances that I've seen in the few years that I've been around, I'm getting older. I can't say that I'm like a seasoned uncle yet. But the vast majority of situations that I've seen where people don't do things right, or they bypass the parents, or they just elope and do like a secret marriage, or that they do things kind of in a shady way and really pushing the limits, the vast majority of those things don't last. The vast majority. And they've actually even done that studies in the broader society on relationships solely based upon romance. And the average divorce rate for those relationships is within 2 years. They don't last long. And as I said, Amjad mentioned yesterday, is that fizzles out very quickly when you do things for that with the best of intentions. So the wedding feast is a sunnah. And one important thing here to recognize is that a lot of people don't realize this. If you are invited to a walima, it's wajib. It's an obligation to attend. And it's an obligation to attend if, one, you're able to. If you're out of town or simply can't, then obviously that's not an obligation. But if you're able to attend, and then this starts to get to, okay, what does able mean? And I saw this beautiful tafsil of the ulama in relation to this. In the end, they say that it's adatan, that whatever custom determines. So let's just say that there is a walima in Philadelphia, right? It's an hour and 15 minutes away, hour and a half away max. And that would you normally be expected to attend that if you were invited? If yes, then it's wajib for you to do so. But let's just say there was a walima in Columbus, Ohio, and they invited you. Yani, that's a little bit far. That you can say, okay, I'm unable to go simply because of how far it is. But this is where ada is slightly different. If you're a close family member, there might be certain expectations that are not there. So what I would say here is that there is a legal amount. I would go out of your way to attend walimas, that if you're able to do so. But if you're able to do so, it's wajib. Wajib. You have to do it. And that they even go into the details of like, do you have to eat or do you not have to eat, like if you happen to be fasting and things like that. But fiqh is beautiful. When you get into the depths of fiqh, fiqh is amazing. And there's certain conditions that they lay out that if any of those circumstances are there, then that it relinquishes that obligation. And so there are certain situations, like if you know there's going to be haram, things unlawful at the wedding, it's not an obligation for you to go. And they actually specifically mentioned if they know that they've only invited the rich to the exclusion of the poor, so it's more of a spectacle, you don't have to go because of that particular reason. And they mention that other things, and that sometimes there's like 3-day celebrations, and they say it's obligation for you to go on the first day, not day 2 or day 3. Once you learn, it's important. This is why we have to have fiqh, because we need to know what it is that we should do and what we should not do. And again, what I will say here about the wedding feast is, let's move towards balance. That unfortunately, we don't have a lot of space in a place like the United States of America, where public space, where we end up having to rent these very expensive halls. But be careful to that be excessive on how much you spend on the wedding. Don't go to excess. Yes, that you can have a large wedding with a lot of people without going into excess. I mean, I've seen weddings that have thousands and thousands of people, but they're not renting that $50,000 halls. Now, partially they have space for a lot of these people. Here, we tend to have less of that. But let's all move towards building a culture here in the United States of America where we're not as extravagant. It doesn't have to be in a 5-star hotel with fancy crystal chandeliers and so forth. Nor does it meant to be boring and be like only 2 people in one. That. Find a nice balance. And really that it's more about the spirit of it than it is anything else. And let's really consider these things about mixing of genders and so forth. And that let the women be with the women and celebrate and do what it is that they want to do, and let the men be with the men and let them celebrate, enjoy, and so forth and so on. But mixed weddings where people are dancing and these types of things together, a'udhu billah, right? These are things that we should avoid, and that you don't want to start off a blessed marriage by doing things that are unlawful in the sacred law. You and I need to build that culture here because we don't have it. We don't have it. We don't have a culture where we could say, oh, that's the way that a wedding should be. Yes, you have one-offs where people do certain things well, but where it becomes an established part of our culture. Let's learn about best practice of people that have done it right and really initiate that. And with our own children, with our own family members, with people that are seeking our advice in the communities, let's point them towards things that are that are of benefit for everyone, and that are within the realms of the sacred law. And then that the last bit of this here is that relations between husbands and wives. And this is oftentimes, actually, sorry, I'm going to skip forward and I'm going to come back to this. There's just a couple things that I wanted to say about divorce here. And again, that needs to be studied, and you should not get married. You should not get married without a lot of different things. But one of them, definitely make sure you know the ahkam of the sharia. You have to know it. And that know the rulings of divorce. Because just as marriage is essentially a verbal contract, divorce is just a pronouncement on the tongue. And there are certain things that when you say them, if you say them jokingly, it's over. And if a man pronounces a 3-fold divorce in one sitting, khalas, the relationship is over, done. You cannot be back with that woman until her waiting period ends and she gets married and has relations with that person, and then goes through a waiting period after her divorce. It's done. Don't search for fatwas. It's over. You were the stupid one to do that unless you really meant it. And sometimes in a fit of rage, you ruin your life, her life and your children's life, and you will be held accountable on Yawm al-Qiyamah before that. And you'd be surprised how stupid people are. Excuse my language. Stupid. Absolutely stupid. Is that divorce is not a joke. And as I heard my teacher say, al-isti'jal bil-talaq dalil fasad al-akhlaq. Someone that hastens to divorce is an indication of someone's that lack of character. They have no character whatsoever. This is not a joke. We don't threaten these things. We don't beat people over the head with it. And that you have to understand the severity of it. It's a pronouncement of the tongue. And unless that you're actually majnoon, legally insane, no matter how irate you are, don't say I was so angry that it was as if I was crazy. No, you were angry. You weren't crazy. There's no way for you to get back with her. It's over. You've just ruined everything by doing that. So don't go there. And to know that if you even jokingly say it, it's over. If you do a threefold divorce. And divorce is up to that threefold. And this is what Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, at-talaqu marratan. Divorce may be retracted twice. You can pronounce it twice. But then we have a choice. فَإِمْسَاكُمْ بِمَعْرُوفٍ أَوْ تَسْرِيحٌ بِإِحْسَانٍ. This is what the Quran teaches. Then the husband must retain his wife with honor, or you could say, in an acceptable manner, بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Treating each other well, which when we get into the rights, this is the number one right of the male for the female and the female for the male, is that you treat each other well. Or أو تسريح بإحسان, or you separate from her with grace, i.e. in a good way. Ihsan. How many of the percentage of marriages that you all know, of all the people you know in your life that got divorced, what percentage of those marriages were done with that principle of ihsan? 1%, 2%, that maybe someone knows that up to 5%. It rarely ever happens. And it's because people lack iman and they lack basic intelligence. And they're not reading Allah Ta'ala's book and they're not committed to the deen. And that I'm going here just to be in, it's important that we know this. And so that when we enter into a relationship, it very well might not work. And it's possible certain people are just not compatible. And that the understanding of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where that divorce is the most detestable thing that is permissible. Divorce is permissible. But the meaning of the hadith is you have to do everything that you can possibly do to make it work. And then if it doesn't work, you go your separate ways in a good way. And that once you go your separate ways, you never, ever, ever even mention that person in a bad way. Not even to your closest friends or family members. And if anyone asks you about it, you zip your lip. It's not permissible for you to even speak about it. This is the way the people of Allah are. Is that they would hide these things. They don't tell people about their marital problems. People have marital problems. It's real. We're human beings. We're not angels. People have marital problems. And that we shouldn't be speaking to people about our marital problems unless we really think that they can help. If you're speaking to someone that can help, it should be done in full confidence. And it's haram for that person to mention it to someone else. But we should not be mentioning our marital problems to people if they're not really helping us. And the whole idea of venting, you have to be careful. Is it really seeking help? Or is it really a means for you just to let out some of the stuff that you have inside? You got to be careful with venting. Venting itself is a slippery slope. There might be certain types of venting that are permissible because you need to talk to someone about a certain situation. But then there's other types of ventings that might not be permissible, where you go too far. And ultimately, we need it as a fard kifaya, a communal obligation for us to have that counselors that can walk people through this in an Islamic way and give people good ways of dealing with marital issues. And that oftentimes this is hard to find if people do not share the same faith as us. So this is the Quranic principle here in terms of if it reaches that point. And the only other thing I'm going to say about divorce is the following. This is the Shafi opinion, but this is important to know, and you'd be surprised how few people know this. There are 3 different types of categories of divorce. There's what's called a talaq sunni and a talaq bid'i, and then a type of talaq that is not sunni or bid'i. And what that means is that there's certain times where it's haram to divorce your wife. People are like, what? What do you mean? In the Shafi school, if your wife is on her monthly cycle, or she's in a state of purity and you've had physical relations with her, it's haram for you to divorce her. It counts as a divorce if you do it, but it's haram because you're prolonging her waiting period if you do it at that time. So just look at this. Look at the way that the Sharia teaches us to be careful about what it is that we say and how serious this is. So if a woman just starts her cycle, and the average cycle is 6 to 7 days, you have to wait till the end of her cycle and then not have physical relations with her and pronounce it then. So it teaches us not just in a fit of rage just to say something. Or that if she's in a state of purity and that you've had physical relations with her, you have to wait till she gets her cycle and then becomes pure. So that could be as much as 21 days or more. Then you can pronounce a divorce after that. But in that period, it's haram. It counts, but it's haram. And so the Sunni type of talaq, and this is the way that they refer, don't think of Sunni Shia or in this sense, is just think of it as permissibility. The permissible type of divorce is the one that was mentioned, is that in an interval between menstruations in which that there has been no relations between husband and wife. And then there are other situations where she is postmenopausal or pregnant where that has its own ahkam that relate to it. But the point here is that we have to know that, and that these are all deterrents for us to try to do the best. And that's the whole idea of divorce being up to 3 times. There's 2 times and then a third. Because the hope is that if it's pronounced once during the waiting period, people will realize like, oh, wow, I wasn't really that happy, but it's going to be a lot worse like this. There's time for people to really think about, wow, I shouldn't have done that. I wasn't appreciating her, or I wasn't appreciating him. Things start to settle in. Reality starts to settle in. I'm going to be on my own. I'm going to be without her. I'm going to be without him. Reality, once it settles in, how many people have remorse? And certainly there are toxic situations where people don't have any remorse whatsoever. But when we talk about the number one right for both men and women is it is obligatory for both husband and wife to treat each other well. That's the number one right. It is obligatory for both husband and wife to treat each other well. This is not something that is permissible, not something that is just recommended. This is a wujub shar'an. It's wajib. You have to treat each other well. And this is taken from verse 220 in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah Ta'ala says that women deserve the like of what they are obliged to give in kindness. It has to be reciprocated. And that ma'ruf, which is kindness, treating each other well, is that it's just as much an obligation for a man to show this towards his wife as it is for a wife towards her husband. And most of everybody is familiar with that rights per se, but I do think that in the conversation even of rights and obligations is that we always have to tie it into the broader context. And any relationship that goes down to demanding your rights is not going to be a healthy relationship based upon a solid foundation. Yes, it's also important to recognize the wisdoms behind the rights that Allah Ta'ala gives. And some of these conversations get very detailed and very sensitive. And in a public discourse, it's probably not the time appropriate to address them. Usually that should be addressed in a more that private-like setting. But you'd be surprised at how many relationships fail because of people neglecting the rights that they're obliged to give as well in a number of different ways. So just because we say that we want to frame the rights that we have to give to people in the broader context doesn't mean that we belittle or overlook the importance of why Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala gave both the man and the woman in a marital relationship certain rights. And ultimately what we want is to find that balance between the letter and the spirit. And that there's a beautiful section here in the book that I recommend, Initiating and Upholding Islamic Marriage, on the duties of the husband. And that essentially is that in addition to that providing for her in a way that is suitable for her upbringing, is that he also has to take care of her in all meanings of that taking care of her, spiritually, that psychologically, and physically. And that this includes that creating opportunities for her to learn her religion. So again, we all know that the man has to support. We all know that. We don't need to be reminded of that. But sometimes we forget these other dimensions, and that the warm intimacy and companionship, pleasant and that righteous behavior, in addition to that the maintenance of clothing, food, and shelter, and then her physical needs as well, but also in relation to what she needs from her religion. And likewise, that there are rights that the husband has upon that her wife, and that includes that among not just that in relation to that physical relations, but also that protecting that the house, that the wealth, children, raising them in the very best of ways, and so forth and so on. And we can go into more details of these. Inshallah ta'ala, we are out of time in the interactive sessions. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. This was probably my least favorite topic to cover over the weekend, but I'm glad that we at least talked about some of that and got that over with. Not to say that it's not important, but I'm always very cautious of getting things down to the bare bones. What we want ultimately is to have full and fulfilling relationships that are filled with ihsan, and how it is that you and I need to be. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the afternoon. When we talk about that Ustad Amjad has a session on what to look for in a spouse. And then the session after that is about temperament, which is now that we're going to challenge ourselves first and foremost to understand ourselves before we even try to understand our spouse. So inshallah ta'ala, that's what's coming next. Thank you for your patience. Apologize for having to step out and get my book there. Allah ta'ala give us tawfiq and bless us in all of our affairs, and to give us fiqh in this religion, and to actualize for us iman, Islam, and ihsan, such that everything that we see it through the lens of iman, Islam, and ihsan. May Allah ta'ala give us tawfiq to put into practice. Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.
Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah, tabarakallah.